Hey. So today we're going to be taking a quick look at how to set up DBT core source freshness for use with DBT State Aware Orchestration, or just if you haven't got it set up yet and you want to start making sure your data is fresh. So we'll have a quick look at kind of the idea behind it, then we'll jump into a practical example. So if you've not come across freshness in DBT before, the idea of it is a basic config on your DBT sources to kind of test, is this data up to date or is it starting to get stale? i.e., is my ingestion working properly? And we can see here on the Orchestra docs, just a very small example of how this might look. So we have a very basic source configuration in DBT with a table as usual. And then we can see this small freshness block, which in this case says, after a 24-hour period, perhaps warn me that this source is not fresh anymore. And because it's an orders table, you're going to want to use the order date field to know when that record potentially came into existence. And if we were to jump over to DBT's documentation for this, you can see there are various ways of setting this, and not loads of options, but a few different things to consider. So we're going to walk through an example of some of those, how they work and what they do. But just so you're aware, if you want to come and read all about how this works underneath and the different caveats and choices available to you, there is comprehensive documentation here. So what is this freshness config trying to tell us? Well, if we look at a basic example here of when my data is loaded here on the left-hand side, that is obviously when it is now fresh. We then provide DBT with 2 periods, or up to 2 periods, because you don't have to configure them both, of when to start warning us that this data is getting stale and when to start erroring out as we need to go and investigate this. This is basically a test failure. So you can see that as time progresses, every time DBT is run between the data being loaded and warn after, it will show a green status as this data is fresh. Moving past warn after's time, it'll start warning us, and then finally moving past that, it'll start erroring out. These can also be considered in different ways using filters. So if you've got different parts of this table that come in from different places, you can test them all individually to say, this one should be received hourly, this one should be received daily. Generally, DBT will expect you to configure a loaded app field. So this will be the temporal column in your data table, usually some sort of load timestamp metadata, or as we saw earlier, like an order date that comes from a source system. But failing that, you can actually just write a completely from scratch load query. So rather than trying to do it with just config, you can just say, hey, here is the exact query you need to know if this is fresh. Obviously down to some format restrictions in terms of what it returns so that it fits into DBT's tests, but the option is there. The time where you don't need a loaded app field is just when you want to let DBT try and figure it out from the underlying database tables. And currently this is supported for 4 different types of warehouse: Snowflake, Redshift, BigQuery, and Databricks. Some of these have caveats about them that you should go and read the documentation and understand before allowing it to do that, but you can just configure it yourself. But what does a practical example of this look like? So I have this DBT source here. The table is called oil data, and it's a Google Sheet that I'm ingesting with Fivetran every half an hour. So I've configured my loaded app field, which for quite a lot of Fivetran sources, you'll have this Fivetran synced metadata column. And then in my freshness block, we can see that I'm telling it to warn me if it's been more than 30 minutes since Fivetran synced this table. So in the unlikely event that there has been a missed ingestion time, this will start warning. And after 60 minutes, start failing. So if perhaps 2 ingestions fail, now I'm going to start erroring in DBT and really know that something's gone wrong. You could put this up higher if the data wasn't that important, or lower if it's much more time sensitive, remove the warn after, have it error immediately. But I've also added this filter just for demonstrative purposes that you could also remove all the deletions that Fivetran picks up, just to be sure you're only testing your usable data in your freshness tests. So what can I do now that I've defined my source freshness? Well, one option is I can now run dbt source freshness, which gives me a nice little CLI level output like this of each of my sources and its current freshness state. And that's very informative, but not the most interesting thing in the world. But what would be really cool is if I could use this freshness testing to understand when I have new data and choose whether to process it or not. This is also possible using things like dbt source selectors or state aware orchestration, which we will come on to later. But for now, that's how to configure source freshness, get it all set up on all of your sources, either in the source files themselves or at project level, and make sure all your data is coming in as you expect. So thanks for watching. Cheers.